Into Autumn by Larry Landgraf. Bright and early the next morning, Lars and Eileen got dressed and ate a hearty breakfast. Lars dug out a holster for Eileen's pistol and handed it to her. He strapped his pistol on and filled a small bag with jerky. Eileen put her holster on. Lars handed her the pistol she had been using for target practice. Then he grabbed a canteen of water, his rifle, and they headed out the door. Lars pointed out the direction to the Weston homestead and told her to lead. "I want you to practice drawing, pointing and aiming your pistol," Lars said. "Aim at anything that catches your eye. I just want you to practice drawing and cocking your gun, and then lowering the hammer and putting the pistol back into the holster. It will help you build your hand muscles, and you will get faster and better at shooting. When you get better, and I'm certain you're not going to shoot me, I'll let you follow me." They walked along, Lars watching Eileen as she handled the pistol and also giving additional instructions from time to time. Lars was pleased at how well Eileen was handling the pistol after such a short time. "You're doing really well," he said. She looked back and smiled. The path to the Weston's place was not nearly as difficult as the route to Reggie's place, and they made good time. It took about an hour to get to the edge of the clearing where Ronald had built his home. Lars told Eileen to put the gun away and take a position behind him. They then stopped behind a large tree at the edge of the clearing. Lars could not see anyone stirring around the house and gave out a big wolf howl. Seconds later, 1, 2, and then a third man stepped out of the already open front door to the house. Lars didn't recognize these men. He just knew Ronald was not among them. The three men looked around for a few seconds and then went back inside. Lars instructed Eileen to stay where she was and to keep well hidden. He then worked his way to the left of the house. Not seeing anything, he moved closer to the rear of the house, near the woodshed. Lars could see a body beside the woodpile. It was Ronald. Lars moved back around to the front of the house and took his position behind a large tree stump, which hid most of his body. Lars pulled the hammer back on his rifle and aimed at the front door. He let out another wolf howl. The three men came out again. This time, the first two men out the door had guns. Lars aimed at the first man and squeezed the trigger. He quickly reloaded and fired at the second. Both men fell immediately, while the third man ran back inside the house. Lars hurried back toward the rear of the home and caught the third man running out the back door, heading for the woods. He made it halfway to the tree line before Lars dropped him. Lars ran up with his rifle, ready to shoot again if necessary. It wasn't. The man was dead, blood oozing out of the hole in the center of his back. Lars hurried back around to the front of the house to check the other men. Lars had been dead on when he shot those two as well. Lars poked the bodies with the end of his rifle. There was no movement. Lars cautiously peered inside the front door and then walked in, ready to shoot if necessary. The house was silent. There had been only 3 men, and Lars had taken care of them in short order. He went into the bedroom and found Sarah on the bed, lying face up, naked, with a gunshot wound on her forehead. The pillow under her head was soaked with blood. He moved closer to the body. There was blood between Sarah's legs, and she had marks on her arms and face. "Bastards!" Lars shook his head in disgust and covered Sarah with a sheet. He then headed back to the woodshed. Ronald was lying face down in the dirt beside the woodpile. There was blood on the leg of his jeans and 2 blood spots on the back of his shirt. He still had the axe in his hand. Lars guessed the men had sneaked up on Ronald and shot him in the back. Then they raped and killed Sarah. Lars walked back to where he had left Eileen. She had watched Lars cut 2 men down in a heartbeat, and then she had heard the shot ring out from the back of the house. She was crying when Lars reached her. "We need to call the police," she said. "And how do you suppose we do that?" he replied. "I don't know, but we need to call someone," Eileen cried, as he led her all the way to the house. "That's not how the world works anymore," Lars informed her. "There is no law anymore." Her tears let up as she thought about what Lars said. Eileen was shocked at how a man who could be so sweet and gentle could be so cold-blooded. But she knew Lars had done what he had to do. Lars took Eileen into the bedroom where Sarah lay. He pulled the sheet back. He wanted Eileen to see what he had seen. He wanted her to know exactly why he had done what he did to those men. When Eileen saw Sarah, she became hysterical. She screamed and her whole body began to tremble. Though she only looked at the body a few seconds and then turned away, Eileen saw the bruises on the arms, legs, and neck of the pale and slightly bluish body. She saw the blood and matted hair between her legs. Eileen then understood the trauma Sarah had suffered through. Lars grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her toward him. He gave her a big bear hug, but a bear hug was not going to comfort her much now. They just stood there for a while, and Eileen finally began to calm down and her trembling lessened. Lars pulled her sheet back over Sarah's body, and they went back outside. Eileen followed softly, crying. Lars found a shovel and chose a nice spot to bury his friends. He began to dig. As Lars dug the graves, Eileen sat on a stump and thought about what had happened. Sarah was such a beautiful woman. That could be me, she thought. Lars is right. There is no law out here to help us. We must help ourselves. And if we fail, we will die, just like Ronald and Sarah. Eileen got up, drew her pistol, and found a target to shoot at. It was only a discolored spot on a nearby tree, but to her, it was an attacker. She pulled the hammer back and fired at the spot. She fired again and again. Her pistol was empty. What the hell are you doing? Lars demanded. I'm killing an intruder, she replied. Lars just stood there in his hole, looking at Eileen as she reloaded her gun. Again, she fired at the spot on the tree. When her gun was again empty, she walked over to the tree to check on her accuracy. Lars got out of the hole he was digging and walked over to the tree as well. Well done, he stated. Thank you, she replied. Eileen could see 10 holes in the tree, all within the dark area she had chosen as her target. What brought this on? Lars asked. I'm not going to end up like Sarah, she replied. Hell no! That is not going to happen to me. Lars smiled, then returned to his hole digging, leaving his red-faced partner to her target practice. Eileen reloaded her pistol 3 more times and unloaded it on the tree. She then reloaded the gun again and stuck it in her holster. An hour later, Lars had dug 2 holes side by side near a large elm tree. Eileen couldn't help Lars wrap the bodies in blankets for burial. She was still very distraught, and her crying continued intermittently. As Lars placed the bodies into the makeshift graves, Eileen picked some flowers she found at the side of the house. Lars began to fill the 2 graves with shovelfuls of dirt. When he was finished, Eileen gently placed the flowers on top. They both just stood there for a moment. Lars mumbled some words and then turned to Eileen again and gave her another hug. Eileen followed Lars back into the house. He looked around and gathered all the ammunition he could find and placed it into a cloth tote. Lars also found 2 .357 Magnum pistols, which he put into the bag. He then gathered up the guns lying beside the dead men and a couple rifles Ronald had that Lars didn't want to carry all the way home. He hid these in the woodshed where he figured no one could find them. Then Lars went back to the dead men. One by one, he dragged them out into the yard. Lars closed the doors to the house, turned to Eileen and told her it was time to go back home. Are you going to just leave these men out here in the yard? She asked. Coyotes and buzzards need to eat too, he said. Now let's get home. Again, Lars seemed so cold-blooded, but she did not say a word. Lars led the way back home, and for a long time, Eileen didn't say a word to him. Finally, about halfway home, Lars stopped. He laid his bag and gun down against a log and turned to Eileen. He took her by the arm and pulled her close to him and gave her another bear hug. Eileen still felt shocked, hurt, and sad for Sarah and Ronald. I'm sorry, he said. Eileen began to whimper a bit, and Lars gently pushed her back and looked into her eyes. I'm sorry you had to go through this, Lars said. It couldn't be helped. If I had not done what I did, the same might have happened to us. We could have ended up just like Ron and Sarah. Eileen nodded her understanding, but she could not help feeling the new feelings she was now experiencing. Eileen had never seen anyone killed. She saw people killed on television and never gave it a second thought. To see two men buckle as bullets tore through their flesh, splattering blood everywhere, became very real for Eileen today. She felt their pain as she jumped from the echoing reports of Lars's rifle. She felt the pain of the man who ran out of the rear of the house as well, though she never saw the man get shot. This was something she would never forget. The one feeling she was not having was fear, though. Her stomach was in knots, but she felt safe with Lars. Lars was a gentle man, but when necessary, he transformed into a killing machine. He could take care of himself, and he could take care of her, she imagined. Or can he? Ronald can protect Sarah. I can learn to shoot like Lars, Eileen thought. But can I kill another human being? I must. I don't have a choice now. Unless I want to end up like Sarah. Eileen managed a small smile and pulled Lars back to give him a hug. "We'd better get going," he said, and they continued their trip home. Lars and Eileen worked together to make dinner. They didn't mention their ordeal throughout the meal. When they were finished, though, Lars suggested they go out on the porch. "We can talk some more while we watch the sunset," he said. Lars refilled and handed Eileen her glass of tea, got his, and together they walked onto the porch. Eileen was first to talk. "I know why you did what you did. It's hard for me, but I know it was necessary. We can't take our safety for granted anymore," Lars said. "We cannot assume everything will work out for the best around here. We need to get real serious about our safety, or we may not live long." "Do you think we'll have more intruders?" Eileen asked. "We need to assume the worst," he replied. "Tomorrow morning, we'll have another shooting session," Lars said. "We need to be prepared and to keep our eyes open around here. I can't leave you here alone anymore," Lars added. They were quiet for quite a while, just sitting there, sipping their teas. "Sarah was the sweetest lady in the world," Lars finally said. "She and Ronald lived there most of their lives. I don't know when they moved there, but it was a long time ago. After Reggie, Ronald was my best friend. He and Sarah were quiet people, unlike Reggie, who had talked all the time. Reggie always carried the conversation when he and I were together. It was much different with Ronald. But when he had something to say, I listened because it was important." Eileen just sat, listened, and nodded. Ronald and Sarah were survivors. Not survivors in the way Reggie and Emily are, but still survivors. They didn't have a lot of guns, but they had plenty of ammunition. They didn't have a large garden, but they always seemed to grow as much as I did. They didn't have tons of prepackaged foods like Reggie and Emily. The Westons lived off the land and were very good at providing for themselves. They were never short of food. Ronald and Sarah had no kids, that I'm aware of. They were just a couple loners who loved the woods. They had their hobbies, and when they were not working at surviving, they worked at their hobbies. Ronald loved to carve things like duck decoys, rocking chairs, and spare axe handles. If he was going to carve something, it had to be something useful. I've got several duck decoys from him, and he taught me how to carve a good rocking chair. I'll need to make me one someday. Eileen never interrupted Lars. She could see he was hurting, and he needed to let it all out. He didn't cry much, but talking about his friends was his way of relief. Eileen went back inside and refilled their glasses. When she returned, Lars continued to talk about Ronald and Sarah. Sarah was meticulous in keeping her home clean. There was never a speck of dust in the house. The stove was always clean. If Ronald tracked in the smallest speck of dirt, she was all over him. "You get those damn dirty boots outside, and then you come clean up your mess," she would say. She was quite a lady. That was mean and nasty what those men did to her. She didn't deserve to go like that. Finally, Eileen could see some tears in Lars' eyes. He was really hurt by what those men did to Sarah. If I'm going to go, a couple shots in the back would be the way. Not like Sarah. Terrible. Lars could not talk about his friends anymore. He was quiet for a long time, his head hanging down as if he were looking at the floorboards on the porch. But he was not seeing the boards. He could only see Sarah's pain. Finally, he raised his head. Beautiful sunset, isn't it? Lars asked. Yes, it is, agreed Eileen. It's hard to believe there can be so much beauty yet so much ugliness in the world, Lars said. Eileen nodded her silent agreement.